The stars burned cold in the endless black of space as the massive warship Deathbringer moved through the void like a metal predator. Inside its armored hull, Commander Vextar stood before a wall of glowing screens that showed the blue and green planet ahead. Earth, another world to add to the Zephyrian Empire's long list of conquered civilizations. Vextar's 6 arms moved across the control panels with practiced ease. His crimson scales caught the light from the displays, and his 4 yellow eyes studied the data flowing across the screens. For 200 cycles he had led the Crimson Phalanx, the Empire's most feared shock troops. They had never failed to crush resistance on any world they visited. "Commander," called Lieutenant Cassith from her station. Her voice carried the sharp edge that all Zephyrian warriors developed after years of battle. "We are receiving transmissions from the planet. The translation matrix is working on their language." Vextar moved to her station, his clawed feet clicking on the metal floor. The bridge of the Deathbringer hummed with quiet efficiency. Dozens of warriors sat at their posts, monitoring weapon systems and scanning for threats. None expected to find any real danger from this primitive world. "What do we know about their military capabilities?" Vextar asked. Cassith brought up a series of images on her screen. They showed crude metal vehicles with wheels, flying machines that looked barely capable of leaving their atmosphere, and weapons that still used chemical explosives. "Their technology is ancient, Commander. At least 500 cycles behind our most basic equipment." Vextar nodded. This would be easier than most conquests. The Empire had faced species with advanced energy weapons, force fields, and faster-than-light travel. Those battles had been glorious but costly. This world looked like it would fall within days of their arrival. "Sir," another voice called from the communication station, "we have translated some of their transmissions. The beings call themselves humans. They appear to have a single dominant species across the planet." "Good," Vextar said. "What about their military structure?" The communications officer, a young warrior named Grixta, looked puzzled. "That is the strange part, Commander. We are detecting large gatherings of humans at specific locations, but they do not appear to be military bases. The translation matrix suggests they are called stadiums or arenas." Vextar's interest grew sharper. Every warrior knew that understanding an enemy's training methods was crucial to victory. "Show me these locations." The main screen changed to display dozens of large circular or oval structures scattered across the human world. Each one was massive, capable of holding tens of thousands of beings. Thermal scans showed that many were currently filled with humans. "They gather in great numbers," Cassith observed. "Perhaps these are combat training facilities where they select their best warriors." Vextar studied the images carefully. The structures did look like arenas where gladiators might fight. Many civilizations used such places to train their armies or entertain their populations with battles. But something about the human gatherings seemed different. "Are there any patterns to when they gather?" he asked. Grixta worked at his station for several minutes before answering. "Yes, Commander. They seem to follow regular schedules. Large gatherings happen on specific days that they call game days. The transmissions suggest great excitement about these events." "Game days," Vextar repeated slowly. The translation matrix was still working on the full meaning of human words, but game suggested some form of competition or conflict. These humans treat their combat training as entertainment. This was not uncommon. The Zephyrians themselves enjoyed watching gladiatorial contests. Many species found that public combat events helped identify the strongest warriors while keeping the population's fighting spirit high. "Commander," Cassith said, "I recommend we observe one of these gatherings before we begin the invasion. Understanding their military traditions could help us predict their response to our attack." Vextar agreed. Knowledge was always valuable in warfare. "Prepare a scouting party. We will use stealth technology to observe their training exercises. Select our best infiltration specialists." Within the hour, a small team of Zephyrian scouts had prepared for the mission. Their adaptive camouflage suits would make them nearly invisible to human eyes, and their equipment could record everything they witnessed. The plan was simple: observe, analyze, and report back on human military capabilities. The scout ship Shadow Fang separated from the main vessel and approached Earth under cloak. Its passengers studied the planet's surface as they descended through the atmosphere. Cities covered much of the land, connected by networks of roads filled with moving vehicles. The population was enormous, much larger than most species the Empire had encountered. "Target the largest gathering," Vextar commanded. His team had identified a massive stadium where over 100,000 humans were converging. Whatever type of training or selection process happened there, it would surely represent the best of human military capability. The Shadowfang landed in a wooded area several miles from the stadium. The scouting party moved through the trees under cover of darkness, their suits adapting to match the colors and textures around them. They could hear sounds in the distance, loud voices, mechanical noises, and what sounded like the roars of a vast crowd. As they approached the stadium, Vextar noticed something odd. The humans arriving at the facility were not dressed like warriors. They wore colorful clothing and carried strange objects. Many appeared to be consuming food and beverages. Some brought small offspring with them. "This does not look like military preparation," Lieutenant Cassith whispered through their communication link. "Perhaps human training methods are different from what we expected," Vextar replied. But privately, he was beginning to wonder if they had misunderstood something about these gatherings. The scouts found a position where they could observe the interior of the stadium without being detected. What they saw inside made Vextar question everything they thought they knew about human civilization. The stadium was divided into two main areas. Most of the space was filled with humans sitting in organized rows, all facing toward a large rectangular field. The field itself was marked with white lines and had tall yellow posts at each end. In the center of everything, two groups of humans wearing different colored uniforms were preparing for something. "Combat gear," Grixta observed, pointing to the uniforms. The humans did appear to be wearing some form of protective equipment, with hard shells covering their heads, shoulders, and other vital areas. But the gear looked primitive compared to Zephyrian battle armor. And the humans wearing it seemed relaxed, even casual. They talked and laughed with each other, instead of showing the focused intensity that warriors should display before battle. "Look at the crowd," Cassith said. The seated humans were behaving in ways that confused the Zephyrian observers. They were eating, drinking, and talking loudly. Many held banners with symbols and words. The noise level was enormous, but it sounded more like celebration than the serious atmosphere of military training. What kind of combat training includes so many non-combatants? Vextar wondered aloud. Suddenly, the crowd's noise reached a new level of intensity. The uniformed humans on the field had begun to move into organized formations. Whatever was about to happen, it was clearly the main event that all these thousands of humans had come to witness. Vextar activated his recording equipment and prepared to document human military training methods. He expected to see weapons demonstrations, tactical drills, or perhaps contests between individual warriors. He had no idea that he was about to witness something that would change the Zephyrian Empire's entire understanding of what humans were capable of. The game was about to begin. The massive stadium lights blazed like artificial suns, turning the night into day. Commander Vextar and his team crouched in their hidden position, watching as over 100,000 humans created a wall of sound that seemed to shake the very ground beneath them. "By the void," whispered Grixta, his voice barely audible over the crowd's roar. "They are calling for blood." The Zephyrian scouts had heard battle cries before. They had witnessed the war chants of a dozen different species. But this was something else entirely. The humans were not just making noise. They were creating a symphony of aggression that made the alien warriors' scales stand on end. On the field below, 22 humans in protective gear had arranged themselves into two opposing lines. Vextar activated his suit's analysis systems to study their equipment. The armor was crude but effective, covering the head, shoulders, and torso. Each warrior displayed numbers and symbols that likely indicated rank or specialization. "Look at their size," Cassith observed. "These humans are massive." She was right. The humans on the field were not the average specimens they had observed in the cities. These were giants among their kind, with builds that spoke of incredible physical power. Some stood nearly as tall as Zephyrian warriors, and their muscle mass was impressive even by galactic standards. "Elite soldiers," Vextar concluded. "They have selected their finest specimens for this demonstration." The crowd's chanting grew more organized. Thousands of voices joined together in rhythmic calls that the translation matrix was struggling to interpret. Words like defense and touchdown echoed through the stadium, though their meaning remained unclear. Suddenly, one human at the center of each formation raised his voice above the others. The scouts' equipment picked up the commands being shouted, but they were spoken in a rapid tactical language that seemed designed for battlefield communication. Omaha, Omaha, Blue 42. Hut, hut! Combat codes, Grixta said with certainty. They are preparing to engage. What happened next would be burned into the memory of every Zephyrian scout for the rest of their lives. At the sound of a high-pitched whistle, the two lines of humans exploded into motion, but instead of drawing weapons or firing energy blasts, they launched themselves directly at each other with a violence that defied all logic. The collision was tremendous. 22 bodies moving at full speed crashed together with a sound like thunder. The impact was so fierce that Vextar's recording equipment registered it as a minor seismic event. Impossible, Cassith breathed. They are attacking with their bare bodies. The humans grappled and fought with an intensity that shocked the watching aliens. They wrapped their arms around each other and threw their opponents to the ground with bone-crushing force. Some humans ran at full speed while others tried to tackle them, resulting in collisions that would have killed most galactic species. And through it all, the crowd went absolutely insane with joy. They are celebrating the violence, Vextar said in disbelief. The non-combatants are enjoying this brutality. One human broke free from the mass of bodies and began running toward one end of the field. He carried a brown oval object tucked against his body while others chased him. The pursuing humans showed no mercy, driving their shoulders into his body and sending him crashing to the ground in a move that looked like attempted murder. The crowd exploded with cheers. Did you see that impact? Grixta's voice was strained with shock. The force of that collision should have broken every bone in his torso. But incredibly, the human who had been tackled simply stood up, brushed himself off, and walked back to join his teammates. There was no medical team rushing to help him. No indication that he was injured at all. He acted as if being violently thrown to the ground was the most normal thing in the universe. Their pain tolerance, Cassith whispered. It cannot be natural. The scouts watched in growing horror as the pattern repeated itself again and again. Humans would line up, crash into each other with tremendous force, and then calmly prepare to do it again. Some collisions were so violent that the sound of impact echoed through the stadium like gunshots. When one human caught the oval object and was immediately surrounded by opponents, Vextar was certain he was about to witness an execution. 5 massive humans converged on the ball carrier and drove him into the ground with combined force that should have crushed his spine. Instead, the human bounced back up and returned to his position as if nothing had happened. This is not training, Vextar realized with dawning horror. This is their natural state. The implications were terrifying. If humans engaged in this level of violence for entertainment, what must their actual warfare look like? How could any species hope to compete against beings who treated bone-breaking impacts as casual recreation? The game continued for what felt like hours. The scouts documented collision after collision, each one more violent than the last. They watched humans throw their bodies through the air to tackle opponents. They saw warriors charge headfirst into defensive lines with no regard for their own safety. Most disturbing of all was the humans' apparent immunity to pain. Players who suffered impacts that would have hospitalized Zephyrian soldiers simply walked it off and prepared for the next play. Some showed obvious signs of injury, limping, favoring one arm, or bleeding from cuts on their faces, but they continued fighting as if nothing was wrong. Look at that one. Cassith pointed to a human who had just absorbed a particularly vicious hit. Blood was flowing from his nose and he seemed unsteady on his feet. He is clearly damaged, but instead of seeking medical attention, the injured human simply wiped the blood away and took his position for the next play. When the action resumed, he threw himself into combat with the same reckless abandon as before. They feel no pain, Grixta said with absolute conviction. It is the only explanation. The crowd's reaction was equally disturbing. Every violent collision was met with thunderous approval. The more brutal the impact, the louder the cheers became. These humans were not just tolerating violence, they were celebrating it, demanding it, feeding off it like some kind of psychic vampires. During a brief pause in the action, the scouts observed something that chilled them to their cores. On the field, players from both teams were calmly discussing strategy while medics tended to the injured. But the injuries being treated were minor cuts and bruises. Warriors who had been violently slammed into the ground were walking around as if they had merely stumbled. Their recovery rate, Vextar murmured. How do they heal so quickly? The question became even more troubling when play resumed. Humans who had been limping moments before were now running at full speed again. Bodies that had absorbed crushing impacts were moving with perfect coordination. Either these beings possessed supernatural healing abilities, or their tolerance for damage was beyond anything in the galactic database. As the final period of the game approached, the violence seemed to intensify. Players threw themselves into collisions with even more reckless abandon. The crowd's bloodlust grew to fever pitch. The scouts found themselves witnessing what could only be described as controlled warfare between two armies of unstoppable warriors. When the game finally ended, Vextar and his team sat in stunned silence. They had recorded hours of footage showing humans engaging in recreational violence that would have been considered torture by most civilizations. And these were not hardened soldiers or criminal gladiators. These were celebrities, heroes, beings that human society clearly valued and celebrated. "Commander," Cassith said quietly, "if this is what they do for fun, what do they do when they are actually angry?" Vextar had no answer, but as he watched the humans celebrating their violent spectacle, embracing each other and raising their arms in triumph, he began to understand that the Zephyrian Empire had made a terrible mistake. They had assumed Earth would be an easy conquest. They had come expecting to face primitive warriors with outdated weapons. Instead, they had discovered a species that treated warfare as entertainment and considered bone-breaking violence to be a pleasant way to spend an evening. The scouting mission was far from over, but Vexitar was already beginning to suspect that the Crimson Phalanx might want to find a different planet to invade. The second half of what the humans called their game began with even more ferocity than the first. Commander Vextar felt his own battle instincts responding to the violence below, his body automatically releasing combat hormones as if he were preparing for war himself. But this was not war. This was recreation. "Commander," Grixta's voice carried a note of panic that Vextar had never heard from the young warrior before. "I have been analyzing the impact data from our sensors. Some of these collisions are registering forces that would kill our own soldiers." Vextar looked at the readings on his portable display. The numbers were staggering. Humans were routinely absorbing impacts equivalent to being struck by moving vehicles. The kinetic energy involved in their collisions should have been sufficient to shatter bones and rupture internal organs. Yet the humans kept getting up and asking for more. "Look at player number 52, Cassith whispered, pointing to a massive human who had just delivered a tackle that sent his opponent spinning through the air. "He is smiling." She was right. The human warrior was not just unhurt by the violent contact, he was enjoying it. His face showed pure joy as he helped his defeated opponent back to his feet. Then both humans returned to their positions, ready to attempt to destroy each other again. They are not just immune to pain, Vextar realized. They derive pleasure from it. This revelation sent waves of terror through the scouting party. Every galactic species had some capacity for violence, but it was always viewed as a necessary evil. Combat was undertaken for survival, territory, or resources. No civilized being enjoyed the act of causing or receiving physical damage, except humans, apparently. The game continued its brutal progression. The scouts watched a human receiver leap high into the air to catch the oval projectile, only to be met by a defender who drove his shoulder into the airborne player's ribs. The collision produced a sound like breaking wood, and both humans crashed to the ground in a tangle of limbs. The crowd roared its approval as medical personnel ran onto the field. Surely this time someone had been seriously injured. The impact had been tremendous, visible even from the scouts' distant position. But after a brief examination, both players stood up and jogged back to their teams. The human who had been struck in midair was even laughing about something with the medic. "Impossible," Grixta muttered. That impact should have collapsed his lung. The alien's horror deepened when they observed the human's reaction to their own injuries. When one player's helmet was knocked askew, revealing a bleeding cut above his eye, he simply wiped away the blood and continued playing. Another human limped noticeably after a low tackle, but instead of seeking treatment, he lined up for the next play and ran even harder than before. Most disturbing was a collision between two of the largest humans on the field. They had run at each other with such force that the impact could be heard throughout the stadium. Both players went down hard, and for a moment neither moved. "Finally," Cassith said with relief, "they have reached their physical limits." But as the scouts watched, both humans slowly got to their feet. One shook his head as if clearing away confusion. The other stretched his neck and rolled his shoulders. Then they looked at each other and began to laugh. They were enjoying the fact that they had nearly knocked each other unconscious. What kind of species evolves to find attempted murder entertaining? Vextar asked no one in particular. The answer became even more troubling as the game progressed. The scouts began to notice that the humans were not just tolerating the violence, they were actively seeking it out. Players would deliberately put themselves in positions where they would absorb maximum impact. They seemed to prefer the most dangerous and painful methods of achieving their objectives. When a human ball carrier could have safely run out of bounds to avoid contact, he instead cut back into the field where 3 opponents were waiting to tackle him. The resulting collision involved 4 humans moving at full speed, creating a crash that registered on the stadium's structural sensors. All 4 humans got up and celebrated together. They are seeking out pain, Vextar said in disbelief. This is not just tolerance, this is addiction. The implications were staggering. If humans were naturally addicted to violence and pain, then warfare would not be something they avoided or dreaded. It would be something they craved. A species that found recreational value in bone-crushing impacts would view actual combat as the ultimate entertainment. The Scouts' analysis equipment had been recording biological data on the human players. Throughout the game, the results were unlike anything in the Zephyrian database. Human adrenaline levels were through the roof. But instead of the stress hormones that other species release during trauma, the humans were producing massive quantities of endorphins and other pleasure chemicals. They were literally getting high from the violence. "Sir," Grixta reported, "I am detecting similar chemical responses from the crowd. The spectators are experiencing pleasure reactions from watching the combat." Vexitar looked up at the thousands of humans in the stands. They were indeed showing all the signs of euphoria. Faces flushed with excitement, bodies moving in rhythm with the action, voices raised in ecstatic celebration of each violent collision. An entire species that derived pleasure from watching their own kind engage in ritualized warfare. The game entered its final phase, and the intensity somehow increased even further. Players began taking risks that bordered on suicidal. One human threw himself horizontally through the air to make a tackle, his body parallel to the ground as he flew into his target. The collision sent both players tumbling across the field in a way that should have resulted in multiple fractures. Both humans bounced up immediately and chest bumped each other in celebration. "They are celebrating the impact itself," Cassith observed. "Not the tactical result, but the physical violence." The final few minutes of the game were a crescendo of controlled chaos. Humans threw their bodies around with complete abandon, seeking ever more dramatic collisions. The crowd responded to each impact with increasing fervor, as if they were witnessing some kind of religious ceremony. When the game finally ended, the scouts expected the humans to collapse from exhaustion or seek medical attention for their accumulated injuries. Instead, the players from both teams gathered at the center of the field and embraced each other. They were congratulating their opponents on the quality of the violence they had inflicted. Winners and losers alike were grinning with satisfaction, their faces showing the unmistakable afterglow of beings who had just experienced something deeply pleasurable. Many were covered in blood, dirt, and grass stains, but they wore these marks like badges of honor. "Look at their posture," Vextar noted. "They are not showing fatigue or pain. They appear energized." It was true. Despite having absorbed hours of punishment that would have hospitalized most galactic species, the humans looked ready to do it all over again. Some were already discussing plans for future games, their voices carrying the enthusiasm of addicts planning their next fix. The crowd began to disperse, but their mood was euphoric rather than concerned. Parents carried small children on their shoulders, already teaching the next generation to appreciate recreational violence. Vendors sold replicas of the combat gear, allowing civilians to dress like the warriors they had just watched. Most disturbing of all were the conversations the scouts' equipment picked up from the departing humans. They were not discussing the tactical aspects of what they had witnessed or expressing concern for injured players. They were reliving the most violent moments of the game, describing spectacular collisions with obvious relish. "Did you see that hit in the third quarter? What a tackle. He really got his bell rung. That was a beautiful collision." Beautiful collision. The humans found violence aesthetically pleasing. As the stadium emptied, Vextar and his team remained in their hiding place. trying to process what they had witnessed. Every assumption they had made about human civilization had been shattered in the course of a single evening. "Commander," Cassith said quietly, "we need to reassess our invasion plans." Vextar nodded grimly. The Zephyrian Empire had conquered worlds populated by warriors, but they had never encountered a species where the entire population was essentially a warrior culture. Humans did not just train for combat, they lived for it. They had turned violence into an art form and made pain into pleasure. "Sir," Grixta added, "there is something else. This was just one stadium on one night. According to the transmissions we intercepted, events like this happen all across their planet, multiple times per week." The full scope of the revelation hit them like a physical blow. This was not an isolated event or a special ceremony. This was normal human behavior. Millions of humans gathered regularly to watch their finest specimens engage in recreational warfare while billions more observed through electronic transmissions, an entire planetary civilization addicted to violence. As they prepared to return to their ship, Vextar took one last look at the now empty stadium. In a few days it would fill again with humans eager to witness more spectacular violence. The warriors they had watched tonight would heal from their injuries and return to inflict more damage on each other, all while their species cheered them on. The Crimson Phalanx had defeated armies, crushed fleets, and conquered empires, but they had the journey back to their concealed ship passed in shocked silence. Commander Vextar and his scouting team moved through the Earth's forests like ghosts, their adaptive camouflage rendering them invisible to any human observers. But the aliens' minds were reeling from what they had witnessed. As they reached the Shadowfang, Grixta suddenly stopped walking. "Commander," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "I have been monitoring human communications during our return journey. There are dozens of similar events happening across the planet right now." Vextar felt his blood chill. "Show me." Inside the ship, they gathered around the communications console as Grixta displayed a real-time map of Earth's surface. Dozens of locations were highlighted in red, each one representing a stadium where humans were currently engaged in similar violent spectacles. "This is happening simultaneously?" Cassith asked. "Not just simultaneously," Grixta replied, his claws clicking nervously against the console. "According to their transmissions, these events occur multiple times per week throughout most of their calendar year. And there are different variations of the combat sport we witnessed." The implications were staggering. What they had assumed was a special military demonstration was actually routine entertainment. Millions of humans participated in these violent activities, while billions more watched and celebrated the brutality. "Access their information networks," Vextar commanded. "I want to understand the full scope of this madness." As Grixta worked, more disturbing facts emerged. The sport they had witnessed was called football, and it was just one of many violent human recreational activities. There were sports where humans hit each other with sticks while moving at high speed on ice. Others where they punched each other in the face until one lost consciousness. Some where they threw each other to the ground using only their bare hands. All of it was considered entertainment. "Sir?" Grixta's voice was strained. "I have accessed what they call highlight reels from their sport broadcasts. These are collections of the most violent moments, replayed for the enjoyment of viewers. The main screen filled with a montage of human-on-human violence that made the alien warriors physically recoil. Slow-motion replays showed bone-crushing tackles from multiple angles, humans flying through the air after devastating impacts, bodies colliding with forces that should have been lethal, and through it all the sound of crowds cheering in delight. They celebrate the violence," Cassith whispered. "They replay the most brutal moments as if they were artistic achievements." Vextar studied the images with growing horror. Each collision was analyzed by human commentators who praised the technique and power behind the impacts. They used terms like devastating hit and beautiful tackle, as if describing works of art rather than acts of violence. "Access their medical databases," he ordered. "Find out how many humans are injured in these activities." The results were even more disturbing than expected. Thousands of humans suffered injuries ranging from minor cuts to major trauma during these sports. Broken bones, torn muscles, and head injuries were common. Some players suffered permanent damage that would affect them for the rest of their lives, and yet they continued to play. "Look at this," Grixta said, highlighting a particular data stream. "Many of the most celebrated human athletes are those who continue competing despite serious injuries. They have a term for it: Playing through pain. The concept was alien to Zephyrian thinking. Pain was the body's warning system, designed to prevent further damage. Ignoring pain was considered a sign of mental illness in most galactic species. But humans seemed to view it as a virtue. More data revealed that some human athletes actually returned to competition while still recovering from injuries that would have permanently disabled most aliens. They wore special equipment to protect damaged body parts and continued throwing themselves into violent collisions. They are not just immune to pain, Vextar realized. They are actively opposed to their own survival instincts. The team discovered even more troubling information as they delved deeper into human culture. The athletes who engaged in these violent sports were among the most admired members of human society. They received enormous financial compensation, public adoration, and were treated as heroes by their entire species. Children were encouraged to emulate these warriors. Schools across the planet had organized programs where young humans learned to engage in scaled-down versions of the same violent activities. Parents actually paid for their offspring to be taught how to tackle and be tackled. They are training their young for violence from childhood, Cassith observed. This is not learned behavior. This is cultural programming. The scouts found footage of human children, some barely out of infancy, wearing miniature versions of combat gear and throwing themselves at each other with the same reckless abandon as the adults. The children's parents cheered from the sidelines, celebrating every collision and impact, an entire species raising their offspring to be warriors. "Sir," Grixta said, his voice now openly fearful, "I have found something else. These sports are not just local entertainment. They are broadcast across the entire planet. Billions of humans watch these violent spectacles simultaneously." The magnitude of the revelation was overwhelming. This was not a small warrior culture or a subset of human society. This was planetary civilization built around the celebration of violence. Every human on Earth was either participating in these brutal activities or consuming them as entertainment. "Access their historical records," Vextar commanded. "How long has this been going on?" The answer made their situation even worse. Humans had been engaging in violent sports for thousands of their years. Ancient civilizations had built massive amphitheaters where warriors fought to the death for public entertainment. Modern humans had simply refined these practices, making them more organized and frequent. Violence was not just part of human culture. It was the foundation of human culture. "Commander," Cassith said quietly, "if this is their recreation, what must their actual military be like?" Vextar had been trying not to think about that question. But as the evidence mounted, the answer became unavoidable. A species that treated bone-breaking impacts as casual, entertainment would approach actual warfare with an intensity that defied imagination. "Access their military records," he said grimly. What they found confirmed their worst fears. Human military history was an unbroken chain of conflicts that spanned their entire recorded existence. They had fought wars using primitive weapons that required close personal combat. They had developed increasingly devastating technology specifically for the purpose of killing each other more efficiently. Most disturbing was the way humans wrote about their own military conflicts. Their historical records were filled with admiration for battles and warriors. They created artistic works celebrating the glory of combat. They taught their children songs about famous military victories. "They do not just wage war," Grixta observed. "They romanticize it." The team found countless examples of humans who had thrown themselves into hopeless battles against overwhelming odds, not for any strategic purpose, but simply because they refused to surrender. Stories of individual humans taking on entire armies, accounts of soldiers continuing to fight even while mortally wounded. "Look at this battle report," Cassith said, highlighting a particularly disturbing account. One human soldier absorbed multiple projectile wounds but continued fighting until he physically collapsed. When he regained consciousness, he tried to return to combat. This pattern repeated throughout human history. Warriors who fought until their bodies literally could not continue. Soldiers who chose death over surrender. Entire armies that refused to retreat even when facing certain annihilation. They preferred death to defeat, Vextar said slowly. This species would rather die than submit. The implications for any potential invasion were terrifying. The Zephyrian Empire relied on quick victories that demoralized enemy populations. They had never faced a species that viewed defeat as unacceptable, and death is preferable to surrender. Sir, Grixta said, there is one more thing. I have analyzed their weapons technology. While primitive compared to our energy weapons, their projectile and explosive devices are designed with one purpose: maximum damage to biological targets. Human weapons were not elegant tools of war like Zephyrian energy beams. They were crude instruments designed to tear flesh and shatter bone. The humans had spent millennia perfecting ways to cause maximum pain and trauma to their enemies. Because they understood pain, they knew exactly how to inflict it, because they had spent their entire evolutionary history experiencing it themselves. As the full scope of the revelation sank in, Vextar realized that the Crimson Phalanx had made a catastrophic error. They had come to Earth expecting to find a primitive species that could be easily conquered. Instead, they had discovered a planetary civilization of beings who were essentially living weapons. Humans did not just have warriors, they were warriors. Every single member of their species was trained from birth to appreciate violence, endure pain, and view combat as the highest form of entertainment. The Zephyrian Empire had never faced anything like this. No species in their galactic database came close. The command deck of the Deathbringer fell silent as Commander Vextar finished his report. For several long moments, the only sound was the quiet hum of the ship's systems. Every officer on the bridge stared at the data streams and video footage from the scouting mission, their faces showing the same expression of disbelief and growing terror. Admiral Thexnor, Supreme Commander of the Crimson Phalanx, was the first to speak. "You're telling me," she said slowly, "that this entire planet is populated by warriors who engage in recreational combat?" "Yes, Admiral," Vextar replied. "What we initially believed to be military training was actually entertainment. The humans we observed were celebrities, not soldiers. And this type of violent spectacle occurs regularly across their entire world." The Admiral's four eyes studied the footage of human football players colliding with tremendous force. Her scales, normally a deep crimson, had paled to a sickly pink color that indicated extreme stress. "Show me the impact analysis again," she commanded. Grixta activated the replay, highlighting the kinetic energy readings from the humans' collisions. The numbers appeared on the main screen in glowing text that seemed to mock the watching aliens. Forces that would have killed Zephyrian soldiers were being absorbed by humans who then got up and asked for more. "These readings are accurate?" Admiral Thexnor asked. "Triple-checked, Admiral," Grixta confirmed. "The humans are routinely absorbing impacts equivalent to vehicular crashes, and they appear to enjoy it." Another officer, Captain Drixaval, leaned forward in her command chair. "What about their actual military capabilities? If this is their recreation, surely their real armies must be—" She trailed off as the implications hit her. If humans treated bone-crushing violence as entertainment, their actual warfare would be beyond anything the galaxy had ever seen. "I accessed their military databases," Vextar continued. "Their history is an unbroken chain of conflicts. They have been fighting wars continuously for their entire recorded existence, and their soldiers display the same disregard for personal safety that we observed in their athletes." He activated another data stream, showing human military casualties from recent conflicts. The numbers were staggering. Humans absorbed casualty rates that would have broken the morale of any other species, yet they continued fighting. "Look at this engagement," he said, highlighting a particular battle. Human forces suffered 70% casualties and still achieved their objective. The survivors did not retreat, they requested reinforcements so they could continue the attack. A collective shudder ran through the command staff. The idea of continuing an assault after losing 70% of your forces was insane by any military standard. But the humans had done it routinely throughout their history. "There is more," Vextar added grimly. "I found records of human soldiers continuing to fight even after sustaining injuries that should have been fatal. Some have been documented as fighting for hours while bleeding internally or with broken bones." Admiral Thexnor stood and began pacing the command deck, her claws clicking against the metal floor. This was supposed to be a routine conquest, another primitive world to add to the Empire's territory. Instead, they had discovered something that challenged everything they thought they knew about warfare. "What about their weapons technology?" she asked. "Primitive but effective," Vextar replied. "They still use chemical propellants and metal projectiles, but their weapons are designed specifically to cause maximum biological damage. They understand pain and trauma because they experience it themselves." The Admiral stopped pacing and turned to face her staff. Opinions? Captain Drixval was the first to respond. Admiral, I recommend immediate withdrawal. Based on this intelligence, a successful invasion would require casualties that the Empire cannot sustain. Agreed, said Commander Zextak from the weapons station. Even if we achieved orbital supremacy, the ground campaign would be a nightmare. These humans do not appear to understand the concept of surrender. More officers voiced similar concerns. The evidence was overwhelming. Earth was not a suitable target for conquest. But Admiral Thexanor had not achieved her rank by backing down from challenges. Commander Vextar, she said, your recommendation is to abort the invasion? Yes, Admiral, he replied without hesitation. Not just abort. I recommend we designate this system as forbidden territory and warn all Imperial fleets to avoid it. The suggestion caused murmurs of shock throughout the command deck. The Zephyrian Empire had never officially avoided a planet due to its inhabitants' military capabilities. They had retreated from technologically superior species, but never from a primitive world. You believe the humans pose that significant a threat? The Admiral asked. Vextar activated the footage one more time, showing the massive stadium filled with cheering humans celebrating violence. Admiral, this is not just a threat to our invasion force. This is a threat to the concept of invasion itself. A species that treats warfare as entertainment cannot be conquered through conventional means. The Admiral studied the images for several minutes, her expression growing more troubled with each passing moment. Finally, she activated the ship's general communication system. All hands, this is Admiral Thexanor. Prepare for immediate departure from this system. Navigation, set course for the Kepler Nebula. Maximum speed. The order was executed with typical Zephyrian efficiency. Within minutes, the massive fleet began moving away from Earth's solar system. But the Admiral was not finished. Communications, she commanded. Prepare a priority transmission to Imperial Command. Classification, Terminal Threat Assessment. This was the highest level of warning in the Imperial communication system, reserved for discoveries that threatened the Empire's entire expansion strategy. It had been used only twice in Zephyrian history, both times for technologically advanced civilizations with planet-killing weapons. Admiral, Vextar said, what should I include in the threat assessment? Admiral Thexanor looked at the footage of human football players one last time, watching these bizarre aliens celebrate recreational violence with the enthusiasm of a religious ceremony. Classify Earth as a Class X prohibition zone, she said firmly. No Imperial vessels are to approach within 10 light-years of their system. Any crew member found attempting to make contact with humans will be court-martialed for endangering the Empire. The severity of the classification stunned the bridge crew. Class X zones were reserved for the most dangerous phenomena in the galaxy: black holes, neutron star fields, and regions of space contaminated with reality-warping energies. Sir, Captain Drixval asked, should we include specific recommendations for future contact protocols? There will be no future contact, the Admiral replied coldly. Humans are to be treated as a galactic hazard. Any species foolish enough to attempt conquest can face the consequences alone. Over the following days, as the Crimson Phalanx traveled away from Earth, the ship's crew continued to study the intelligence gathered during the scouting mission. The more they learned, the more convinced they became that they had made the right decision. Human history was filled with examples of their species' unnatural relationship with violence. They had created entire industries around their violent sports. They wrote songs and stories celebrating warfare. They built monuments to honor their most successful killers. Most disturbing was the discovery that humans had weapons capable of destroying their entire planet, yet had chosen not to use them. This suggested a level of restraint that was somehow more terrifying than their capacity for violence. A species that could annihilate itself but chose not to was clearly operating under psychological principles that no other civilization understood. They are holding back, Cassith observed during one of their analysis sessions. Everything we witnessed was humans restraining themselves. This observation haunted the entire crew. If recreational football represented humans restraining themselves, what would they be capable of when truly unleashed? The answer was too terrible to contemplate. When the Deathbringer finally reached Imperial space, Admiral Thexanor's report caused chaos throughout the command structure. Emergency sessions were convened to discuss the human problem: military, Strategists tried to develop contingency plans for potential human expansion into galactic space. All plans ended with the same conclusion: avoid humans at all costs. The official imperial decree was issued within a month. Earth's solar system was declared off-limits to all imperial vessels. Trade routes were adjusted to avoid the region entirely. A permanent monitoring station was established at the edge of human space, with orders to watch for any signs of human expansion and immediately alert Imperial Command. The Crimson Phalanx, meanwhile, was reassigned to conquering civilizations with more reasonable military capabilities. Worlds with energy weapons, faster-than-light travel, and advanced defensive systems. Anything except planets populated by beings who treated bone-breaking violence as a pleasant way to spend an evening. Years passed. The human prohibition zone became accepted fact throughout Imperial space. Other galactic civilizations learned of the restriction and, after reviewing the Zephyrian intelligence reports, implemented their own bans on human contact. Earth became known as the Madness World,